So I was very excited to be asked to give this presentation. I really do believe that there are a lot of take-home messages, lessons learned, and things that the U.S. can benefit from being aware of as we move forward in our preparedness for foot and mouth disease. The passion, or my passion, I guess particularly for this topic, came after working in the dairy industry as a private practitioner in the Petaluma area for a number of years, going back and doing an MPBM at UC Davis. And then right at the end of that program, it was essentially 2001, the outbreak started in England. So going over there, seeing the devastation that that disease caused to their livestock industries firsthand has had a lasting impression on me. I couldn't imagine coming back to the U.S., knowing our level of preparedness at that time relative to theirs, which was somewhat similar, and knowing that I might have to go back and essentially, slaughter the herds of people who had become my very good friends in private practice. So that's continued to drive my interest and focus on this topic for many years. So I'll start off with a quote. Winston Churchill once said that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that no truer words could be spoken in regards to planning and preparedness for foot and mouth disease. So with that in mind, I want to go back and provide a historical perspective on foot and mouth disease, touch on many of the outbreaks that have occurred in free countries, as well as make some observations with regards to countries that are endemic with this disease. I hope this will serve as a nice foundation or a basis for the rest of our discussions in the meeting today. Now, while foot and mouth disease is a worthy adversary, I want us all to remember that it's not the Armageddon virus. There are ways to control and contain and manage this disease, and it's important to remember what we've learned over the course of history about this virus, and then also keep in mind the many changes that are to our agricultural industries that have occurred over time. So we've learned a lot more about the virus. We're in a lot better position in terms of diagnostics and vaccines, but the efficiencies in our animal agricultural systems have provided new challenges to controlling and containing the disease while still maintaining viable industries at the end. Well, many things related to foot and mouth disease have not changed over time. Many things have, but still great challenges remain. So let's reflect just briefly on some of the properties of the virus. The virus, we all know, is very highly infectious and contagious. Just a very small amount can cause infection in an animal. But it's not a hardy virus. It's easily killed by simple things like vinegar, bleach, and citric acid. Well, it can make livestock very, very sick. Most times it is not a killer. And often the highest mortality rates historically have been associated with the control programs that were put in place. It's a major disease that prevents world trade of animals globally, and when outbreaks occur, there are always high societal, economic, and human consequences. It's been a significant disease threat among the livestock industry since the 16th century. In the late 1800s, Loeffler and Frosch first showed that foot and mouth disease was caused by a submicroscopic particle. Like at that point in time, they didn't even know it was caused by a virus. They were able to show that animals that became infected then were solidly immune, and that one inoculation of a fluid from an infected animal into another animal provided protective immunity. That was the basis for the vaccinology moving forward. The fact that this virus had more than one subtype, and there's 7 subtypes and seven serotypes and many subtypes of those serotypes. The fact that more than one type of foot and mouth disease existed wasn't even discovered until the 1920s. So really, we've come a long way since some of the early discoveries of this virus. The United States has had 9 outbreaks of foot and mouth disease over the course of history. The first in 1870 up in the northeastern region, and the last in 1929 in California. In all but 2 instances, the disease was able to be eradicated within just a few months. However, in October of 1914 was the largest U.S. outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the U.S. history. The disease spread rapidly across the country after gaining entry into the Chicago stockyards. During the outbreak, Over 3,500 herds became infected across 22 states, including the District of Columbia. The outbreak lasted 11 months. It cost the government $4.5 million to eradicate the disease. The outbreak originated in Michigan and spread through the National Dairy Show. And it spread through the National Dairy Show is what largely led to it becoming an epidemic. Before the National Dairy Show had opened, some of the folks in charge of that show had warned about the concerns of the rumors of this disease that was going on and wanted to stop the show. But they decided that the livestock show needed to go on. In November of that year, the first infected cow was discovered at the show. That necessitated the closing of the Chicago Union stockyards, which were closed for the first time since their opening. That idled 35,000 workers and cut off some $1.2 million in daily revenue. For 7 months, no animals were allowed in or out of that yard, and people that were moving in and out had to be disinfected. And it's actually interesting going back and reading through some of these historical papers. They used to disinfect themselves by fumigating themselves with formaldehyde. So they'd put on these little cloaks and then release formaldehyde under the cloak. The pictures are very interesting. And well, thankfully, we don't have to do that today. But before the epidemic was stopped, every cattle market in the U.S. had become affected by movement restrictions, and complete animal quarantines had occurred in 22 states. The 1914 outbreak was caused by a very mild form of foot and mouth disease that led to its not being diagnosed for a substantial period of time because it was confused with necrotic stomatitis. That permitted the disease to spread without recognition to a significant number of herds. There were no tests or diagnostics available at this time for foot and mouth disease other than inoculating live animals and seeing whether or not they got sick. That was the only test that was available. So definitely diagnosing the disease was a very, very difficult challenge. All right, let's fast forward a few years to 1924. This outbreak was the second to the last in the United States and occurred in California. It was thought to be introduced from a ship that had returned from the Orient that had its garbage fed to local hogs near the port of Vallejo. That then led to the infection of cattle, swine, and sheep throughout the state, and eventually infected 16 of the 58 counties in California, including stockyards in Los Angeles, Stockton, and San Francisco. The eradication effort involved the slaughter of just over 100,000 head of animals and 22,000 deer at a cost of $6 million. Of the 22,000 deer that were killed at that time, it's reported that 10% of those animals had lesions that were consistent with foot and mouth disease. So I bring up this outbreak because it's often referred to by highlighting the involvement of deer that led to the necessity of them being depopulated. That effort was a very intensive effort that involved 250 hunters and 43 camps across 1,000 square miles. But I would like to point out that there has never been any definitive evidence that the clinical signs that were observed in these deer were caused by foot and mouth disease. It's important to remember that other endemic diseases of deer look very similar to foot and mouth disease, and that in 1924 they did not even know that foot and mouth disease was a virus. They did not do any animal inoculations from the lesions collected from these deer. And other endemic diseases such as epizootic hemorrhagic disease, blue tongue, deer adenovirus, or BVD could have also been responsible for those lesions. The oral lesions that you see in the photos I have projected here were taken as part of the wildlife surveillance efforts in the United Kingdom outbreak in 2001. That deer was tested and was not positive for foot and mouth disease. The remainder of all those samples collected in the UK outbreak were all tested negative in deer. And I'll refer as we move forward to wildlife testing in outbreaks in Japan and Bulgaria and South Korea, where deer were tested within proximity to known outbreaks and not found to be infected. So, we know that deer can become infected with foot and mouth disease. There's no dispute of that evidence. But what we observe in history is that they have not played a major role in the spread of the disease, even in areas where they're present to some degree. So the role that they are likely to play in a major epidemic would generally be small if it occurred, I would say, in the United States. which is a good thing. We have enough to worry about. So this is a map of the current conjectured global foot and mouth disease status. It's a composite based on reported diagnosis, expert opinion, and it was compiled by the World Reference Lab. I'm including it here to emphasize that foot and mouth disease is widespread globally and endemic in many countries. And in those endemic countries, there's often many different strains of the virus that are serotypes and strains that are circulating. We hear about the outbreaks that occur in previously free countries. So what I'll do now, again moving forward, is touch on some of the key lessons from some of these other historical outbreaks that have occurred outside of the United States. So first we'll start with the Taiwan outbreak in 1997. Located about 125 miles off the coast of China, there are two main things I'd like to highlight from this outbreak. The first is that the strain of foot and mouth disease that was involved in this outbreak was a strain that only produced clinical signs in pigs. It never produced any clinical signs or disease in ruminants. That phenomena, which had never been observed before since this outbreak, led to a lot of confusion and a lot of misdiagnosis initially, where individuals thought that this was actually swine vesicular disease, which was endemic in Taiwan at that time. This should remind us that foot and mouth disease can have many different types of clinical presentations in many different species. It's not one disease. The second point that I think is important for us to keep in mind is this is an example of how economically devastating foot and mouth disease can be to an industry in a country. Prior to this outbreak, Taiwan had been a major pork exporting country. Ultimately, over 4 million hogs on over 6,000 farms, or 38% of their swine industry, were destroyed, with the total estimated cost of the outbreak being $1.6 billion. 65,000 jobs lost, and continuing export losses estimated to be at $2 billion a year. Vaccination was eventually used, but its use was delayed until 2 months into the outbreak. They have had subsequent outbreaks since 1997, and the vaccination there continues today. They have yet to be able to achieve the OIE status of free with vaccination, and this significantly has impacted their ability to rebuild their swine industry and because of the lack of ability to export. There were 4 major factors that contributed to the rapid spread in this epidemic. First was the inability to shut down auction markets early in the outbreak. The second was the delays that they had between detecting the disease and depopulating and disposing of the infected animals. Third was the high density of hog farms in the area. And the final one was lack of adequate quantities of vaccine when they finally decided to implement a vaccination program. So forward a few years to the UK 2001. Much has been learned and shared about the experiences that a number of the U.S. veterinarians had when they went over and participated in this, as well as much has been published. And I can tell you that really that there's nothing that makes a more lasting impression on someone than experiencing things yourself. I was very fortunate to be over there for a 3-month period of time, scattered over a number of the different phases of the outbreak. This outbreak was caused by a Pan-Asia type O, foot and mouth disease strain, ultimately led to the infection of 2,000 farms, but the depopulation of 10,000 farms. I think one of the lessons there is that automatically doing a contiguous cull or destroying all the stock on a farm just because it's a neighbor to an infected farm is not necessarily an appropriate automatic strategy. One of the other important lessons there is the importance of early detection. The index case there, which was a swine farm, went undetected for almost 3 to 4 weeks. There was dramatic clinical disease present in that farm. It was just in a situation where the farmer was unwilling to report any problems on his property. During that time, the virus infected sheep. The sheep were transported all over the country, and that's what seeded the outbreak very widely before it was ever detected. I also learned there the tremendous value of having access to animal and premises ID in terms of assessing and responding to the outbreak. The fact that we don't have a complete system here in place, we just have to openly recognize that that is going to greatly hinder our ability to respond, to be able to assess on day one the full magnitude of the outbreak. And the way that will likely pan out then is that the people involved in the response are going to have to cast a much wider net, not knowing exactly, not having a better estimate of where disease is and isn't. So it's going to mean that the movements of a much larger number of animals and businesses will be impacted from the outset. A third important lesson is the establishment of an early and effective movement ban or strict management or biosecurity of any movements that occur. To make this work requires clear communication about what needs to be done, an active industry role, participation, cooperation, and commitment, because it's really, there's just absolutely no way that any type of regulatory authority can effectively enforce what really needs to be done to stop the spread of the disease at that point early in the outbreak. I was continually impressed by the dedication, the perseverance, and the resiliency of the farmers in the United Kingdom. It was a tragedy that early in the outbreak, they did not have good knowledge and were not given good information about how to establish good biosecurity to protect their farms. When we talk about outbreaks, we are always struggling to quantify, like we use a lot of numbers to quantify things, costs, numbers of disposed of animals, etc. But I think it's really important that we keep in mind that there are significant human impacts of these diseases, and these costs, they're things that we can't put numbers on. They can never be quantified. Essentially, this outbreak has changed the face of, or the landscape of British agriculture. They learned the hard way that not being better prepared to implement effective biosecurity and to be in a better position to rapidly implement a large-scale vaccination program led to the depopulation, essentially, of 10,000 farms, or the loss of 10,000 farming families' incomes and livelihoods. This picture in particular is one I took, was on a farm, and that's actually the herdsman in the green jacket who wanted to light the pyre. When I see this picture, it gives me still a very visceral reaction. I can still smell that. Obviously, we're not going to be burning carcasses like that. It's another lesson we've learned, I think, from the United Kingdom. But this, I think, is just a really good illustration of some of the human costs and the emotional toil that this disease can put people through. All right, so let's fast forward then, or go around the globe to Uruguay. So essentially in the same time frame that the UK outbreak was happening in England, there was another outbreak happening in Uruguay. Uruguay is in South America, nestled in, south of Brazil and north of Argentina. This is an outbreak that really didn't get a lot of attention in 2001 in the U.S. The livestock industry and the animal health officials there were quite aware of the risks and potential consequences of a foot and mouth disease outbreak, and that's because foot and mouth disease does circulate in some countries in South America. Uruguay is a country, it's about the size of the state of Washington. It's fairly sparsely populated with 3 million people, half of those living in the capital city of Montevideo. And they have 3 million cattle, and back in 2001, 8 million sheep. So they had been free, and they're also a major beef exporting country. Back in that time, I believe they were 6th in the world. So they had been free with vaccination, they had been free without vaccinating for almost 10 years, and had just quickly controlled a very small outbreak in the northern border of their country with Brazil early in 2000. But when they first started to be concerned that they might have infection again in 2001, they had a sense very quickly that the situation was very different. This was a rapidly spreading outbreak in a dairy-dense region of their country, which is in the sort of southwestern part of Uruguay. They had detected 28 infected farms in just the first 5 days. They quickly, on day 4, decided to implement a responsive ring vaccination program in 10 kilometers of the known infected premises, using what they could acquire in terms of a bi- and trivalent commercial vaccine that had it was an A serotype outbreak in it. They got this vaccine from vaccine manufacturers in Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, and Argentina, and essentially just tried to beg, borrow, and steal whatever they could get in order to start this program. The initial strategy was to vaccinate those animals in the ring and then send them to slaughter. But that was quickly changed to a national cattle vaccination to live policy on day 7 of the outbreak. And this was largely driven by an understanding that this outbreak was going to be very, very large scale. And it was really industry pushing government that sort of helped to switch the strategy and then provide the impetus to get the large number of doses of vaccine that were necessary. By day 7, they had 131 infected farms. The farmers administered the vaccine themselves, distributed through a system that the ministry designed and that also involved the use of the military. They did 2 rounds of national vaccination that took about 30 days each, 12 million doses being administered in each round on about 50,000 farms. There was a livestock movement standstill in place, and that remained until 2 months following the last dose of vaccine. So the outbreak there involved essentially a similar number of farms to what was involved in the UK, about 2,000. They vaccinated in the face of disease. So if there was an infected farm, they would wait till any clinical disease would resolve, and then they would come back and vaccinate that herd. They did not cull any vaccinates, and in the end, they only destroyed 7,000 animals in that entire outbreak. Though the outbreak was primarily in beef cattle, it did involve 384 dairies. There was never any disruption in milk movement. There was no milk dumped, but they did implement a strategy by where known infected farms were all picked up on the same routes, and that milk went to a condensed milk plant. The vaccine used for the outbreak, as I mentioned, was a commercial product, but unfortunately at that time it was not an NSP or non-structural protein-free vaccine. They were, however, able to, based on serological testing that began quickly after the outbreak and doing testing for many, many months, they were able to resume most of their exports, their beef exports, within a year's period of time through negotiations with their trading partners, but they were not declared OIE-free with vaccination until May of 2003. They currently still vaccinate. They vaccinate 3 times a year. And they monitor both for seroconversion to make sure the vaccine is providing, they're seroconverting to the vaccine, and then they also test to make sure that there's no virus circulating in the population. All right, so UK 2007. This outbreak's interesting for a couple reasons. It was a relatively small outbreak, but occurred in close proximity to the World Reference Lab in Pirbright. It was felt to have been caused by an escape of a virus from a nearby vaccine manufacturing plant. It fortunately was a very small outbreak, and it occurred in an area where there was not a very high density of livestock. In the end, there were only 8 infected premises and just under 300 animals involved. But I think one of the things that's interesting here and why I have these are actually pictures of the lesions of the animals on the index case. One of the interesting things here was that the disease was so far advanced in that herd before it was ever discovered. So this was a small grazing beef herd of 38 animals. All 38 had very obvious clinical lesions by the time it was first detected, indicating that the disease had the oldest lesions were estimated to be about 9 days old, and they estimated that the disease infection had taken place 2 to 3 weeks previous to it ever being detected. So it's, I think, one of the key factors we can take away from this is that the way an outbreak unfolds has a lot to do with the density of livestock in an area and the nature of movements of the farms that become infected. So because this was a grazing cattle operation, there was a very low rate of contact, a very low rate of movement, and in that case, a very small outbreak, fortunately. It should also be noted that they benefited greatly from the outbreak being in such close proximity to the World Reference Lab. They were able to do a lot of really great work, molecular work, that ultimately will help, I think, in informing approaches to molecular epidemiology in outbreaks as we move forward. So now we'll move forward to Japan in 2010. This outbreak in 2010 was Japan's first outbreak since 2000. It was controlled using stamping out, movement restrictions, biosecurity, and emergency vaccination to kill. It was contained to the Mizanki Prefecture, which is a really lush mountainous area in the southwest. In the end, there were 300 infected premises and about 200,000 animals that were on those infected premises. The initial suspicion of disease was on a farm that housed 16 cattle, and the confirmation of that disease on that farm took about 2 weeks. So again, here we have a delay in diagnosis of the index case. The epidemiological investigation estimated that the virus had been present and circulating in the area since March, and that there were up to 10 farms that were infected at the time of its first detection. Delay in destruction of the infected animals, the inability to implement good biosecurity, and the disposal challenges that they had were some of the major factors that led to the spread of this disease. Emergency vaccination was initiated about 2 months into the outbreak. They, in retrospect, wish they would have switched to that control strategy sooner. They vaccinated all susceptible species in the control area. The government and private veterinarians administered the vaccine. So in Japan, only a licensed veterinarian is allowed to give a vaccination. Of note here was that they did do pretty extensive wildlife surveillance in deer and wild boar in the area, and all those animals were found to be negative. Disinfection stations were established on major roads and around movement control zones and livestock industry vehicles, and then it was expanded to all vehicles in June. At the peak, they had 403 disinfection stations, and this prefecture is maybe half the size of LA County. So it's geographically, the outbreak was in a very, very small area. The after-action report called out that the delay in detection, delay in destruction, and carcass removal, and the delay in implementing the vaccination control program sooner were the factors that contributed the greatest to the extent of the outbreak. And we are really lucky right now in California. Dr. Kazuo Murai is a veterinarian from Japan who was involved in that outbreak. He's currently doing an MPVM at Davis and working with CDFA and some foot and mouth disease planning. So we're very fortunate that he's been able to share a lot of his personal experiences of that outbreak with us. So moving forward, South Korea. There was a lot in the media about the South Korean outbreak. One of the main things that made the media was the large number of documented cases of inhumane depopulation or the burial of live pigs. So South Korea itself is a country that's just a little bit larger than the state of Indiana. It has 48 million people. Foot and mouth disease was confirmed there in October of 2010 on a swine premise. The initial approach to controlling the disease involved culling, movement controls, and biosecurity. All animal movements were prohibited except going directly to slaughter. The livestock markets were all closed. The disease was very easy to recognize in dairy cattle and pigs, but they had a lot more difficult time identifying disease in the beef cattle, goats, and farm deer populations. In dairy cattle, it was interesting in this outbreak that they reported a lot of teat lesions or udder lesions, which is not something that's seen with a lot of the serotypes. Eventually, they established 2,500 vehicle disinfection posts. Effective cleaning and disinfection was very difficult in this outbreak due to the freezing conditions in the region. Disposal was also a major challenge, with there being over 4,000 mass burial sites that needed to be monitored, first established and then subsequent to that monitored over time to assure that they weren't impacting the water supplies. They decided to switch to emergency vaccination in January of 2011 and purchased over 30 million doses of vaccine. Some of that came from VAC that was donated from the North American Foot and Mouth Disease Vaccine Bank. This outbreak significantly impacted the people in that country and resulted in food shortages and increased food prices. Next, I just wanted to make a few comments about the outbreak in Bulgaria and Turkey, and primarily as it relates to the involvement of wild or Eurasian boar in that area. So in this area, which is referred to as Thrace, the Bulgarian-Turkish border, the disease was first detected in a hunter-killed wild boar, which is that little kind of white star with a blue rim on it. The hunter had noticed some lesions on the boar's foot, but no one suspected FMD initially. Eventually, it was confirmed, and was shown to match samples that had been collected in Turkey previously. So prior to this outbreak, Bulgaria was largely free. Turkey is known to be FMD infected, but has a pretty low level of infectivity along the border with Bulgaria generally. There were 2 waves of infection that occurred in this area, and they did extensive serosurveillance in the livestock in these villages in this area, as well as the wild boar, red, and roe deer in those areas. Ultimately, the European Food Safety Authority issued a scientific opinion with regards to the involvement of wildlife in the outbreak. The statement reads that the foot and mouth disease introduction into Thrace by wildlife is less likely than due to the introduction through movement of domestic animals and or byproducts. Based on a systematic literature review, currently available surveillance data in wildlife and epidemiologic modeling, foot and mouth disease will not be sustained in the wildlife population in Thrace, although limited spread of foot and mouth disease may occur in time and space. The most important risk factors associated with the introduction and spread in this area include biosecurity, movement of live animals and animal products, swill feeding, and access to landfill waste. This situation was a really unique opportunity to do very extensive work trying to understand the role of the Eurasian boar and what that might be in the epidemiology of FMD. Well, it's not explicitly known how the disease might be different in feral swine or wild pigs if it were introduced in the United States. I would argue that it's reasonable to say that it is unlikely that they would play a major role in the spread or maintenance of foot and mouth disease in an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. That's not to say that feral swine and wild pigs are not an incredible nuisance species and could play major roles in foreign animal diseases such as classical swine fever and African swine fever. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some things that we can learn from countries that are endemic with foot and mouth disease. So vaccinology for foot and mouth disease is very complex. We don't need to get into the weeds here, but in order to be prepared to implement effectively and rapidly a responsive vaccination program, it requires multiple levels of preparedness. And different individuals can be involved and engaged in those different layers of preparedness. We need to be prepared to have large numbers of adequate doses available quickly, as well as be able to administer that vaccine quickly in the animals, identifying them, managing, and tracking them. So as we move forward to enhance our preparedness in this area, I think we can learn a lot from countries like Uruguay, who vaccinate for foot and mouth disease every year, as well in a free country, as well as countries that vaccinate annually to control endemic problems. The example I'll talk about here is Israel, where they have epidemics caused by serotype O that occur frequently. They have a routine vaccination program where they use a hexavalent, so 6 different strains are in the vaccine that they use routinely, and also for emergencies in cattle, sheep, and dairy animals as needed. Beef, sheep, and dairy. So an interesting detailed investigation took place during an outbreak that occurred there in 2011. They did a detailed investigation on a dairy and adjacent feedlot. And what was interesting here was they had this very heavily vaccinated population of animals, the last animal being vaccinated in most groups about 3 months before the outbreak strain was introduced. The outbreak strain was a type O, and there were 3 types of O in the vaccine that the animals had received. The test to look at the matching between the outbreak strain and the vaccine strain showed that the match was not very good. It was 0.37 for people who know that. So it wasn't good, but you might expect it to provide some benefit. But it largely didn't. So 96% of the animals in that one group I'm talking about specifically, 96% of the animals showed serological evidence of getting infected, and 50% of those animals actually got clinical disease, which was very, very surprising. In contrast, what's interesting here is that animals in that same herd who had received a dose of that same vaccine, but received that dose 2 weeks or less before they got exposed, those animals showed no clinical signs, and very few of those animals showed serological conversion or evidence of getting infected. So what that says is that there's something else going on other than the development of antibodies from vaccine that's important in protecting animals, at least from clinical disease. And I know that's a lot to take in without numbers and stuff on the slide, but the point here is that we have a lot to learn about vaccination, and I think there's a lot to be gained through the development of new and novel vaccines and other type of immunomodulating agents that might help us in that short window of time between when an outbreak's occurring and when animals get exposed. And then I'll mention just quickly something about the outbreak in Egypt. The epidemiology of foot and mouth disease in North Africa is complicated by the circulation of many different types of serotypes and subtypes of foot and mouth disease. They get sporadic incursions of viruses from other areas in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. There's a very large livestock population there at risk. And in 2011, they had an outbreak of SAT2 that occurred in Egypt. What was very interesting about this outbreak was that there was a very high death rate in adult cattle in an endemic region. So these cattle had been exposed to probably a number of different serotypes of foot and mouth disease, but this SAT2 was highly lethal in that population. About 10% of the exposed adult cattle were suspected to have died or estimated to have died. The phylogenetic analysis indicated that virus was likely introduced from Libya and likely through the migration of migrant herders or the movement of migrant herders. So, as I mentioned earlier, foot and mouth disease is not one disease, and we can't think about it as one disease. There's some common things we can do to control and contain it, but the need to produce, in this case, to rapidly produce new diagnostics and new vaccines in order that they could effectively control this SAT2 outbreak was a great challenge for that region. All right, so reflecting back on, there's a lot of examples that we could go over. I tried to pick what I thought were some of the most interesting and the most poignant. But reflecting back, it's not surprising to see a number of common threads with regards to the challenges that people face in outbreaks in free countries. And there's, again, I think a lot to be learned from these things. So I think first, one common thread is the importance of early detection, reporting. Those are always key. There are many different reasons that that detection gets delayed. A lot of times, it's the it can't happen here mentality. In some cases, it was using the wrong test. Sometimes it's lack of reporting by the owner of the animals that are infected. But when diagnosis is delayed, bad things happen. Number two is that effective biosecurity is critical no matter what happens, no matter what strain or subtype or where it happens. Biosecurity is key to minimizing the extent of the disease and controlling spread. And the better that biosecurity is on a daily basis, then that means that the disease, can't spread far before the outbreak is discovered. So the better we are on our daily biosecurity practices, the smaller outbreaks we're going to have in general. And then when necessary, so you don't always need to use vaccine, but if you have an outbreak that looks like it's going to be large scale, that's likely in these times going to necessitate the use of a responsive vaccination program. And to do that and do it well and allow it to have its greatest impact, we need to do it quickly, efficiently, and effectively. So where are we now, like the good news? The good news is that we know a lot more about foot and mouth disease, the virus. We have much better diagnostics. We're working on better vaccines. There's still a lot of things that need to be done in those areas. In general, I think, compare this to 10 years ago, we have greater awareness of foot and mouth disease. But again, we still have a long way to go in that category. The new challenges we have are related primarily to the improvements that have been made in the livestock industries, the speed of commerce, and so we need to balance control measures in terms of the speed of commerce and facilitating. Dr. Zach, I think, will talk a little bit later on about continuity of business projects. So how can we control and contain the outbreak without destroying the livestock industry with the control measures? So, I like to close with just saying, to me, a lot of this is not rocket science, but we need to do it with our heads out of the sand. And we need to be prepared to focus on the things that we can where we can have a difference, where we can have a difference on high impact things. There needs to be an willingness to invest in planning and preparedness. We've definitely come a long way, and as I said, we're much better prepared to control and contain an outbreak, but we have a long ways to go. And it's really working together that we can get to the next level of where we really need to be. I mean, we really need to be in a place where we can implement effective biosecurity and large-scale vaccination programs very quickly, efficiently, and effectively. And that takes both industry and government working together to meet that objective. So I'd like to just close by saying I think we need to learn from the past, and I hope we're all here and ready to work and move forward in investing in preparedness for the future. So thank you very much.